Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the spring edition of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign Civil and Environmental Engineering Faculty Research Webinar. My name is Doug Pelletier. I'm on the alumni board for the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, and I will be your moderator tonight. We have the pleasure of having Professor Guest, and his topic tonight is Chartering Technology Development Pathways in a Circular Bioeconomy. I discussed with the professor, he will take questions throughout the presentation. I would just ask you maybe raise your hands so we don't have people talking over each other. And I believe that's it. Keely, do we have any housekeeping comments as far as like the PDH paperwork?
Yep, so after the session tomorrow, I will go ahead and send out that PDH form to everyone that participated.
Excellent. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Professor Guest.
All right, thank you, Doug, and thank you, Keely, and the CEAA Alumni Faculty Subcommittee for the opportunity to present today. Based on with teams, I may or may not see the hand raised, Doug, so go ahead and interrupt me if you see one raised, and we can make sure people can ask questions as we go. So you should see opening slide, but it's I'm very happy to tell you a little bit about our work. My group, we do a balance of experimentation, modeling, and something we call quantitative sustainable design, which I'll tell you a little bit about. Just to start off, so all this work is made possible by the wonderful students here at UIUC. So this is my research group, and we have a great balance of sometimes undergraduate students, and then a lot of master's and PhD students, and some postdoctoral researchers as well, and then some alumni from our group who are now faculty or research environmental engineers. I'm going to highlight some work in particular by Professor Yalan Lee and Dr. Hannah Lohman in this work. We have a range of funding agencies, and I'll acknowledge those as we go as well. But to give you a sense, this circular bioeconomy was in the title, so I want to tell you a little bit about what we mean by that. So we work in this with the intent of recovering resources and making society more sustainable. And so if we think about things starting with agriculture, we have agricultural inputs like fertilizers. We produce food and bioproducts and biofuels that then go on to the marketplace, and we can try and recycle things through resource recovery, send nutrients back to agriculture, and maybe recover carbon and other fugitive resources like CO2 or others. Well, our group mostly focuses in these two circles on the left and right here. So we do process engineering. And so the resource recovery is where my background started. I did resource recovery from wastewater, and the skills that we apply in this context in environmental engineering, which are things like mass balance and reactor design, were highly relevant to this green circle on the right for biofuels, bioproducts, and even food production. And so those are the two contexts in which my group works. On the left, we think of these as human-derived resource systems, essentially like everything that you eat. The nutrients, especially the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, you excrete right back out. And so people then are part of resource cycles with critical agricultural nutrients. Then on the right side, we think about taking plants and converting them into food, fuels, and products. And so we work on the center of this right graphic, the biorefinery itself. And I'll give you an example from each of those as we move through today. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go through this talk in three parts. The first one will introduce quantitative sustainable design, this structured approach that we use. And we say to expedite RD&D, where on the bottom here, the RD&D is just research, development, and deployment of technologies. So research and development, that's what goes on in the lab and then scale up. And then deployment is where's the most effective place to use these technologies or to send them. Then we'll talk about an example about advancing technologies and systems for sanitation and resource recovery. And then lastly, I want to use an example that's outside the traditional kind of environmental engineering space, but that we've been working in for the last 8 or so years on what we call precision fermentation for biomanufacturing. But that's using some of the same skills that we learn, develop in environmental engineering, but applying them in a way to produce products, not just manage waste. So starting off at the top here, so when we think about what sustainability means, we have some system that we're starting with, let's say some sanitation system, our agricultural system, and we have some aspirations for sustainability. And so we want to break this down and use a couple key terms. One is we might have goals. Those would be these broad qualitative statements like we want affordable sanitation and we want nutrient circularity. So we want to move in that direction is a general idea. But to know if we're making progress, we need indicators. So these are going to be quantitative measures that help us understand, are we moving toward or away from that goal? And that might be things like dollars per person per day for sanitation, or the percent of phosphorus that's recovered to agriculture. That would be for nutrient circularity. And then as an organization, as a utility, as a society, we can set targets. And so these would be trying to achieve specific values of the indicators with specific timetables. So for example, by 2030, we want to achieve sanitation that's less than 5 cents per person per day, or we want to achieve 50% phosphorus recovery to agriculture. Those are the types of targets we might set. And a lot of our organizations have these, a lot of cities have these, the university has these in our climate action plan, targeting reducing carbon emissions by a certain date and even being carbon neutral by 2050. So those are targets. Now, as we try and move in that direction, so we have some baseline system on the left, and we want to know, can we move? We want to move to the right toward our goals. What first thing our group does is we define the problem space, and that means it's understanding the combinations of decisions that you can make, all the ways that technology can perform, and all the places, all the contextual parameters, all the places you could deploy it. And so the decision variable, these are the things as engineers that we design or control. And so if I'm designing a wastewater treatment process, for example, I might be specifying retention times of all my basins and the loading rates, which configurations I want to consider, and so on. So these are the choices I get to make. Then for technological parameters, these are now the assumptions I have to make about all the parameters that govern my system. So once I've picked my retention times and the configuration, I have to make assumptions about what kinetics will actually be observed, how long materials will last, how efficient is each piece of equipment that I've selected. So those are things that we would usually measure or assume based on material properties or equipment. And then lastly, we have our contextual parameters. And these are all the non-technological factors that are going to influence design and performance. So these are things like, how is the project financed? For wastewater, what is the local diet? How big is the system? What's the local weather? If rain or other inclement weather is going to affect the system. So this matters a lot about where we put the technology. And so we break down these three categories and we sit down with technology developers and we say, okay, what are all the choices that you can possibly make? These decision variables, what is the minimum retention time you're willing to accept and the maximum you're willing to accept? And what is every configuration that could be chosen? And then we go and look at the experimental data or the literature and say, all right, what are the kinetics do we expect to observe in this system? And then we look at all the places we could deploy it. And so we break these things down and we put it into this, what we call a QSD, or this quantitative sustainable design methodology. And so once we have this set of decision variables and technological parameters and contextual parameters, all the values they could possibly be, we then develop design algorithms. So we basically just write out the equations that allow you to generate a detailed design once you know these things on the left. And so this is exactly what we teach in our courses as we go through design. So if in wastewater process engineering, for example, like if we know the wastewater characteristics and the effluent quality that we want to achieve, and we specify our solids residence time and the configuration, there's a set of calculations we can go through to dictate the exact size of every basin, the pumping rates, and everything else. So that would be generating our detailed design. We code that. So we just write it in Python so that it automates this process of going from our inputs on the left to our detailed design. And then we also have process algorithms. So this is how we simulate performance over its lifetime. So again, if I'm going to use wastewater treatment as an example, we have standardized process models that let us predict how the system will perform day to day. as there are fluctuations in temperature or influent characteristics and things like that. And so we also put all that into our code into Python. And then once we have this, we can layer on methodologies that get us to our indicators. So we care about cost. So we can do techno-economic analysis or life cycle costing. We care about broader environmental impacts. So we can do life cycle assessment, which is a way to get to things like the carbon intensity or the kilogram CO2 equivalents. We can layer on additional analyses, like if you want to understand risk and you have a risk assessment methodology, you can layer that on. Whatever types of analyses you want, we just automate this process that once you have the design, once you have its simulated performance over its lifetime, what does it cost? What were the environmental impacts? What other indicators do you want to consider? And we get to these indicators that vary by project. But for example, for wastewater, a lot of times it's for our work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it's going to be dollars per person or dollars per capita per year or per day. It's going to be kilograms CO2 equivalents per person or per capita per year, things like that. And then in all these technologies, all these evaluations, there are a lot of assumptions that we have to make, and we want to acknowledge that, embrace that. And so anytime we do this process, we always include uncertainty, which means we acknowledge that we've made a lot of assumptions and there's knowledge that we don't have, or things that are just intrinsically variable. So just people's diet is going to change over time. And there are lots of people coming and going from the city, for example, so flows are going to change. And then we do sensitivity analyses so that we can try and understand what are the key drivers of these sustainability indicators, what assumptions really matter and what assumptions don't. So if I have to make 500 assumptions to do an analysis of a technology, I want to know which 5 really, really matter. And then I can put more effort into making sure I feel comfortable with those 5. And so we've done this in a lot of different technologies. A lot of our work relates to algal wastewater treatment. And so this is a paper that just came out. Well, it just got accepted last week, so it's just in press right now. But of an algal wastewater treatment system that we were doing bench scale work for our first few years here, and then we've been partnering with a startup company called Clear as Water Recovery. And thanks to funding from NSF and the Water Environment Reuse Foundation, now called the Water Research Foundation, or they merged with the Water Research Foundation, and the US Department of Energy, we've been working with them to look at their scaled up systems, which are now as big as 2.8 million gallons per day. So there are now 3 full-scale installations of this algal technology in Wisconsin, actually. And we've done these types of analyses. We've done these types of analyses on a technology called anaerobic membrane bioreactors. And this is where you take wastewater and you can produce methane from the wastewater. We have an ongoing project right now on hydrogen and methane production from wastewater for like food industry wastewaters or things that are really high in organic carbon content. And that work continues. And then another example is hydrothermal-based processes. And so these are where we take any kind of organic waste. This can be algae or wastewater sludge or food waste, anything. And you subject it to high temperature and pressure, and you can produce oil and ultimately fuels, biofuels, and fuel gases and recover fertilizers. And so we have ongoing projects with that with the National Science Foundation. And this ongoing project actually includes PFAS destruction for those interested in perfluorinated compounds or worried about perfluorinated compounds. We're working with wastewater treatment plants to look at how hydrothermal liquefaction can destroy PFAS as well. So in all these projects, and we have lots of others in which we've collaborated, there are standard sets of questions that people have, the technology developers or the utilities, the end users. And it's things like, okay, what are my costs? What is the cost? What is the carbon intensity? And so we think about this as characterizing sustainability indicators. So for cost, we'll get a baseline value. That's our little diamond here. And there's uncertainty around it. So we'll say, oh, we're pretty sure, costs with 90% certainty, costs will be below this value. We can do the same thing for carbon intensity and so on. But we can characterize those indicators of a design or a deployment scenario. Another one that we often get asked is what are the key drivers? So we can think of this as another phrase for it as a hotspot analysis. But okay, well, what is driving my cost? What is the biggest contributor to cost? What is the biggest contributor to carbon intensity? And we can figure out what are the the big bars versus the little bars. So is it electricity is a really big driver of carbon intensity, and methane is a small driver, or what? We can set technology targets. So this is one of our favorites. So here what we're doing is we think about something like cost. And let's say we have a target. We talked about targets earlier, but for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we want to hit 5 cents per person per day for sanitation. So we can think about a particular assumption we're making or design decision, and we can say, okay, well, what does that need to be to hit that target? And so we can actually run analyses and say, oh, all right, well, my baseline is our technology is currently performing here, but I need to move to the right all the way, over here in this range, where we have the gray bar on the bottom to be able to hit my cost target. And is that possible? And let's focus efforts on pushing to the right on this graph. We can understand sensitivity. So we do global sensitivity analyses to say, all right, I had to make hundreds of assumptions, and we can distinguish between the assumptions that matter in the upper right from the assumptions that don't matter in the bottom left, that aren't key drivers of our variability. And one of my favorites is we can explore research, development, and deployment pathways. And I have this Rubik's Cube. I'm going to come back to it later. But the idea is that we can say, all right, we've got this cool technology. What are all the ways it can be designed and all the places it can be deployed? And can we prioritize where we should be looking, or where this opportunity has the greatest potential to have societal benefit? And we can focus our efforts there. Now, one of the challenges with this type of work is when we started down this path, we used to do these analyses kind of one at a time, and a student would work on a project, and the next student they'd publish a paper and go on and into their career, and the next student would come on and we'd try and pick up their work and build on it. But unfortunately, every student had their own code, so they write this in. We used to work in like MATLAB, for example, and they'd have their own code, and the next student would pick it up and have no idea like why they coded it that way or what this meant, and so it was really difficult to build on even our own work, and so it's very difficult for anyone else to build on our work. And when we turn to things like proprietary software, so if I wanted to use, like in wastewater, GPSX or Sumo or BioWin, and if I'm in the biomanufacturing, things like Aspen or SuperPro, if I want to use these softwares, they'll give me, they're very expensive sometimes, like Aspen. Greed is free, but they'll give me an individual value. They won't be able to answer any of these questions that I have, really. I mean, they can kind of identify sustainability drivers. That's about it. And so it's very difficult to work with them or to be able to answer the types of questions we have about how to move a technology forward. So as a result, we had to develop our own. So we have a couple open source software packages we've developed, and it's important to us. Like we work at a state institution, a public institution. We're funded with federal money. We want this to be open source, so anyone can use it anywhere.
Why?
And we're hoping that others, adopt the software, can build on it, and share their work as well. And that's what's happening. It's going really well right now. We have people all over the world using both these software packages. But on the left, QSD-SAN, this is more for wastewater and resource recovery. And on the right, BioSteam is more for biofuels, bioproducts. But to give you a sense for what it looks like on the left, we have all these resources for people to learn the material. There are tutorials, there are Read the Docs walks you through how to install it, how to use it. And on the right, it is in Python, so it is code, but we have automated like process flow diagrams, and you can get costs and life cycle environmental impacts and pressures and concentrations, everything. So this has been, both of these have been well received by industry and by other researchers around the globe. So we're enjoying to continue to build these out over time. So what I'd like to do is transition and tell you a little bit about how we've applied like that type of work first in sanitation and resource recovery for wastewater treatment. So as we think about setting targets for sanitation, there are goals or targets for global sanitation coverage. So if we look from, this is 2015 on the left to 2022 on the right, and these are global data sets. only 57% of people have access to safely managed sanitation. That means that their bodily waste is separated and treated, or they're protected from it. 81% have basic sanitation, which means there's some separation from people and the waste, but it's not treated, and not necessarily treated. This difference here is not treated. And then 95% don't need to defecate in the open, which means they have no toilet of any kind. So 5% of people still have to defecate in the open. There are targets, the Sustainable Development Goals, that essentially we provide sanitation for all. So they want to get this 57% number up to 99, more than 99% by 2030. We are not on track to do this. And we didn't hit the Millennium Development Goals, which were set for 2015. We're not on track to hit the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, but there's a big push to re-envision sanitation and how to make this possible. At the same time, there are other pressures like urbanization. And so the graph on the right, what you're seeing here is rural is in the yellowish on the bottom. And then as we go to the darker from red to blue, we're talking about bigger and bigger cities that people are in. And so as we go over time, yes, population is increasing as we go to the right, global population, but also these bars at the top are getting wider, and the rural is getting narrower, which means that more people are living in more populous areas. And so as we think about sanitation, we can be thinking about deploying technologies in more urban environments or more centralized environments. And so when we think about meeting the needs of low-income populations around the world, or resource-limited populations around the world, the conventional approach is to deploy latrines. And so if there were a building, an apartment building, for example, a lot of times what will happen is they'll put basically a concrete tank in the ground, and then trucks will come. This is a Vector truck, will come and suck out the waste monthly or whatever frequency it needs to, and then haul it off. And so people will pay for this truck to come and gather the waste. And then hopefully it goes to a wastewater treatment plant, and hopefully it's treated properly. That's not always the case. Sometimes these trucks go to a low-lying area and just dump it into surface waters. And also sometimes the centralized plants don't operate all that well. And so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation over the last 12 or 14 years has invested a lot in sanitation technology development. And the intent is to develop technologies that treat waste on site, like right where it's generated. And so this includes single unit reinvented toilets. So within a household, having a toilet that treats the waste to make it safe right in your house. The others are called multi-unit reinvented toilets, and these are ones for more like 100 to 500 people, let's say, where you can have a bunch of toilets connected to it, and then all those toilets just by pipe flow into this little container unit, which can be picked up and put down just about anywhere. And then lastly are the omni-processors, and these are more like 10 to 12,000 people, and they mostly manage like fecal sludge. And so if collect people, there's something called container-based sanitation that the toilets are set up to gather the waste without diluting it with water, and then it can be hauled to the omni-processors, and it just makes it biochar and completely safe. And that can do that at very low energy, essentially energy neutral as it operates. And so these are examples of technologies that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has invested in. And so we've worked with teams that have developed these and other technologies, about a dozen or so around the world. And one example is with something called the new generator. And so this technology was developed over the last 10 years with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the team that developed this is at University of South Florida. And so they had run this system. It's essentially, for those interested, it's an anaerobic membrane bioreactor with ion exchange and electrochlorination. And they've operated it in different locations, including South Africa and India, and in small trials in Florida. And they can run this with grid electricity, or in places where there is no grid electricity, they use photovoltaics to power it. So what we do is we work with the team and we leverage any data they had. And we were lucky that with this team, they had a 1.5 year field trial in South Africa. And so there was a separate organization in South Africa that does testing of sanitation technologies, and they had put it in an informal settlement, low-income setting, and run it for an extended period of time. They typically had about 100 users per day using this facility. And we simulate the scale up because they've now handed this, they're working to hand this over to a manufacturing company and to deploy it. But we're scaling up to making 100,000 of these units and selling them around the world. And then we look at it having a lifetime of about 25 years. That's not for all the components. That's for the system overall, the housing and some of the main components, but the pumps and others and membranes are replaced much more frequently. And then what we do is we build models of all the different units, the toilets and how the waste would be pre-treated before it goes into the anaerobic membrane bioreactor. We call this a nutrient capture system and chlorination, and then pasteurizing or heating up the sludge before it's managed as a waste. And we track everything. We build models of everything. And when we run our analysis, this is what we get. So on the x-axis here, we have cost. So this is US dollars per person or per capita per day. So we wanted that target of 5 cents per person per day down about here. So we're much higher than that. We're more about around 14 cents per person per day. And then on the y-axis is greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is very interested in, but so are organizations like the World Bank. And so they are now only investing in projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so, and this is kilogram CO2 equivalents. So it's a greenhouse gas kind of normalization unit per person per year, per capita per year. And so what you see is the green is if we take this new generator and we hook it up to photovoltaic cells. So, and then the blue is if we do grid-tied energy in this South African settlement. And you can see that with grid-tied energy, the greenhouse gases are a little higher than in the photovoltaics. And they're similar costs, but photovoltaics are a little bit more expensive in this setting. And then we can compare this to the existing system, which is pit latrines. And then they transport it to a centralized facility and do AD is meant to be anaerobic digestion. And so what you see here is that this is on the high end of the greenhouse gas emissions relative to our technology, but it's much less expensive. So it's more like 2 to 3 cents. So these will not be deployed just because they reduce greenhouse gas emissions incrementally. The costs have to be brought down. And so we work with the team to identify priorities for research and development and how they can bring down those costs. And we spend a lot of time with them figuring out what every component they can change out, how they can, what increasing loading will do, and so on. And then they go back to their next set of trials and try and bring down costs. And they're working on that right now. But we've done this with a bunch of teams. And so I want to share kind of like how this story comes together for the foundation. And so we've got models of things like the biogenic refinery, which is this Omni processor, a really big unit, 10,000 people, the new generator, which is the example I just used. And another example would be called the reclaimer, and this is for about 120 people. And this takes liquid from septic tanks and does ultrafiltration and granular activated carbon, ion exchange, and again, electrochemical disinfection. But this one's developed out of Duke. So when we look at these three technologies, we wanted to look at all the where you could deploy it and what the implications would be, how our answer would change about which technology might be best, for example. And so we gathered a whole bunch of data like construction labor wages and facility manager wages and electricity unit prices and the greenhouse gas intensity of electricity and so on, household sizes and animal protein intake and vegetable protein intake and so on. We found these data for 77 countries, and so we started our analysis there. And then, so what we did is for every individual country or data set from a country, and for every technology, we're going to look at daily costs, so same axis as before, so US dollars per capita per day. And on the y-axis is going to be greenhouse gas emissions, so kilogram CO2 equivalents per capita per year. And so if I put 1 point here, that's essentially just a general set of assumptions. We use global averages, and the technology did cost this much money and had this much greenhouse gas emissions. But we're going to run it for all 77 countries. And so a given technology, so it's blue, that's actually going to be the reclaimer in a second. Each square here is a different country's data set. And then we did this under uncertainty because, well, even if we have a data set for a country, it's going to vary dramatically, even within a city. The waste you get and the characteristics can vary. And so if we push and pull these assumptions, it will land somewhere in this blue box. So we call this the problem space for this technology. And so if we do this for all three technologies, we can see that the reclaimer using grid electricity will land somewhere in this box. Wherever we put it, however it operates under uncertainty, like all the changes we could make about the technology, it will land somewhere in this blue box. And the new generator, the first example I gave, will land somewhere in this gray box. The biogenic refinery will land somewhere in this red box. That's not the big omniprocessor. And so it starts to give us a sense for how variable are our results. So if somebody asks me how much does a new generator cost, I don't want to just say 14 cents per person per day. That was our estimate in an informal settlement in South Africa. But it depends. The cost depends on where you put it. Same thing for the reclaimer and the biogenic refinery. And this is a first set of assumptions. This is if they use grid electricity and if the biogenic refinery is treating pit latrine waste. But we can also think about if we connect them to photovoltaics. So they use solar energy on the reclaimer or solar energy on the new generator. And they use UDDT as a urine diverting dry toilet for the biogenic refinery, which is something they wanted to explore. And we could see what it does to costs, and all three of these essentially, in many cases, they bring down cost a little bit, but I'm sorry, in many cases, they increase cost a little bit, but they decrease greenhouse gas emissions. But that's not always the case. And so what this lets us do when we then do like a global sensitivity analysis, we push and pull these models, we can understand that here are the key things we really need to know about a location. So we have to know labor wages, and price level ratio gives us an idea for how expensive like materials will be in a location. For anything that's tied to the electricity, that's using grid electricity, sure, electricity price and global warming potential is really important. If we're doing pit latrines or using solar or photovoltaics, caloric intake is really important. So how much people are eating. So the impact per person, like their caloric intake matters a lot. And for the biogenic refinery, the animal protein intake and the household size matters a lot to get to these US dollars per person per day and kilogram CO2 equivalent per person per year. So that helps us when we work with the foundation, that if they have a new technology idea or we're working with a new utility, and so we're continuing this type of work now in cities around the world, we don't have to ask them for 100 detailed things about every type of transport distance and if I'm looking at the new gen and the reclaimer, I don't really need to know household size or the distance between 2 points, or how far would the resources go to the waste location, or the efficiency of different things. I only need to know about 8 things to be able to give a reasonable idea for how the system will perform. And then we can at least then structure our conversation and be more focused in moving forward and exploring options for the community. And so this gets us back to our Rubik's Cube. So I really like my Rubik's Cube, but the idea of this problem space that we're calling this like an n-dimensional conceptual space, whatever, but it's all those decision variables, all those choices that you can make, every single one, the configurations you can choose, the loading rates, the retention times, the solids residence times, whatever, the dissolved oxygen set points, every choice you can make, every assumption you can make about the technology, the maximum specific kinetic rates or the lifetime of the membrane or whatever, the contextual parameters, the flow, the ambient temperature, the population's diet, everything. So if we vary all those things across all possible combinations, I'll have a result for every single one of them. And then what we want to do is we want to identify the opportunity space. So that is, what are the combinations of these inputs? What are the combinations of choices you can make of like how the technology performs and of where you put it that leads to, for example, a technology like technology A winning every time or in every way. So it has the lowest cost and the lowest greenhouse gas emissions and the lowest whatever else you care about. What are those conditions? What are these little squares here that led to technology A winning in every way? And then what are the squares that lead to technology B winning in every way? And what are the ones that lead to trade-offs, so that we can focus our efforts and say, if we're talking to technology developers, we can say, hey, your technology outperforms others or has the greatest potential for success if you can improve these aspects of the design and you focus on these types of places to deploy it. And then we can give other guidance to technology developer B. And then if we're working with a municipality, or with a community, a utility, a company, we can say, all right, what are the features of your location, and then which technologies are likely to be the best choice for you. And so as an example of how this plays out, so in the study I was just going through, if we look at the new generator or the reclaimer, there are certain conditions in which, like, the new generator has lowest cost and lowest emissions. And there are certain conditions in which the reclaimer has lowest cost, although it never has lowest emissions. And that has to do with, in particular, the labor wages. And so there's a tipping point at about $20 to $22 an hour that all of a sudden the reclaimer becomes preferred because it's lower labor intensity, or so it's less labor intensive, but it's more material or capital intensive. And so at higher labor wages, all of a sudden the reclaimer becomes the lowest cost alternative, and at low labor wages, the new generators tends to win out. And so this was the case in like 66 of the places we analyzed versus 11. But we can start to zero in on, all right, what are the locations in which a technology might have the greatest potential? And so we also understand that it's not just about this, like, taking a technology, building a model, pushing and pulling the model, and then telling people that this is the right one. We recognize that there are a lot of features of these systems that require engagement with the social sciences and engagement with stakeholders. And so we've also done work in communities, especially in Uganda, where we work with non-governmental organizations on the ground, with social science researchers, agricultural researchers, and local governments to understand kind of the dynamic interactions among all these pieces here: people's user experience, the safety of women and girls, on-site storage and health impacts. We've done work on child fecal matter exposure and health outcomes, and a lot of other kind of analyses in this space. And what we're doing over time is we're building this portfolio of modeling tools to then help decision makers make transparent and informed decisions. So we consider things like, all right, we want to talk about nutrient recovery. Well, it should matter whether or not they currently have access to nutrients, because if they don't, then nutrient recovery can be more impactful. We want to know the co-location of nutrient supply, that's people, and nutrient demand, that's crops, and what that means for the forms of the nutrients that what form should it be in, because we can recover liquid treated wastewater that has nutrients in it if agriculture is really close by. But if we have to transport it long distances, we might want to recover the nutrients as a crystal fertilizer, which is essentially just the nutrients, a much lighter weight and much easier to transport. We also look at soil context. And so we work with soil scientists and agricultural researchers to understand, well, we don't want to take, let's say, an alkaline product and put it on a soil that's limited because it's so alkaline. But it might be beneficial to apply it to an acidic soil. So we try and understand what are the soil characteristics and what does that mean for which products we might want to recover. We also look at something called ecosystem services, and that's things like by just enhancing the environment around us, by supporting, like, let's say, improved tree growth or prairie lands or others. We can support water filtration and carbon sequestration and other natural environmental benefits. And then we also look at investment opportunities. So can we recover resources and close these resource loops in a way that sanitation can be driven by investment, not just by aid? So not just by USAID and government investment or aid, essentially. They think of them maybe as donors, but instead moving away from donor-driven advancement of sanitation and more investment-driven, such that we can recover economic value in waste so that there's an economic incentive to treat waste properly. And then the last section, so that was the sanitation and resource recovery, and that's I don't want to say it's not necessarily like totally, it's not certainly not conventional, but the domain of waste management is the core of environmental engineering. It has been for a very long time. So sanitary engineering, from even the early 1900s, we were offering classes in the U.S. on sanitary engineering, wastewater engineering. That field has fit squarely in civil environmental engineering since its inception. Another field that we've moved into because it paralleled resource recovery so well was this idea of precision fermentation and biomanufacturing. And the idea here is that this facility in the middle that we convert plants to biofuels and bioproducts is designed with many of the same principles as our resource recovery facilities or wastewater treatment plants. And so we're excited to kind of bring our approach, bring our skill set to bear on in this context. And so just to provide a little background, the U.S. Department of Energy and Department of Defense have been investing heavily in research and commercialization to replace the whole barrel of oil, is what they say. But the idea here is that if we have a barrel of oil, on the left, it's what it ends up as by volume. So about 40% goes to gasoline, another 24% to diesel, 9% to jet fuel, 16% to chemicals, and then 9% to other stuff. Well, the value of that, though, these fuels are about half, and this chemicals up top is about half of the value of the barrel of oil. And we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars a year for chemicals, and hundreds of billions of dollars a year for these fuels. And so the intent is to shift away from the barrel of oil or fossil fuels and start to do bio-derived materials, or use any kind of renewable resources to produce these same products. And so on the right, I'm showing just a pretty picture of a lab on campus called the iBiofab lab that does automated discovery of microorganisms to help with this process to produce biofuels and bioproducts. And a lot of this funding comes from CABI, which I'll introduce in a second here. This is the Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation, which is housed here at Illinois, and it's funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. So this is an overarching figure of CABI. CABI is this bioenergy research center. There are 4 bioenergy research centers in the country. CABI is kind of the newest, and of the 4, we are in our 7th year, and it is funded at over $260 million over 10 years. And so CABI includes right now roughly 60 faculty level researchers. That includes 30 at Illinois across lots of departments. There are roughly 200 plus or minus graduate students, undergraduate students, technicians, postdocs in CABI. And so it has 3 thrusts. One is feedstock production. These are folks who genetically modify plants. And in particular, we focus on what are called perennial grasses that grow back year after year. So you don't have to plant them every year, like miscanthus and sugarcane. And then also sorghum, which is an annual but has some environmental benefits. But these grasses are much more environmentally beneficial. They can actually add a lot of organic carbon to the soil as they grow, so they can help sequester carbon. And they're great feedstocks. They grow very quickly. Sugarcane is the fastest growing plant on Earth. And then we send those plants over to conversion. And so these are mostly synthetic biologists who develop microbes that can take the sugars and lipids from plants and then turn them into very specific compounds, like 3-hydroxypropionic acid can replace lots of things that are required for plastics. Triacetic acid lactone can replace lots of different industrially relevant compounds and so on. And lastly, there's the sustainability theme. My group is in the sustainability theme. This includes folks who look at what happens in the field and the plant and soil and microbe interactions. It includes estimates of field level greenhouse gas emissions and yields. It also includes our work at the biorefinery, so how to actually convert the materials and then understand the costs and environmental implications. And then lastly, there's market level analyses to understand what would this mean for the United States. Where would crops be planted? Where would biorefineries be located? How would it enter the marketplace?
Professor Guest?
Yeah.
We have one person raising their hand for a question.
Okay, wonderful. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Guest. Really random, curious thought. You mentioned that those plant products can be used for plastics, would that impact the biodegradation properties of the plastics? Because I know plastics in plastic waste is a major concern environmentally as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biodegradability of plastics is a parallel but equally important issue. And so there is research. So most of the research going on in CABI, for example, is centered around the production of the plastics in the first place, but they can make them in a way that they have potentially they're biodegradable. There's separate work on campus that does some really cool things with how to take the plastics are essentially, these polymers. So they have a way to, for certain plastics, to put them back into their monomer, which lets you completely reuse them to make them truly recyclable. So there is separate work on campus in that space. And there's other kind of parallel Department of Defense research initiatives. They're called U.S. Manufacturing Institutes. And there's one called Remade that focuses on things like that. So yeah, it's certainly a relevant topic, and it's CABI is mostly focused on producing the plastics, but then we do think about the properties of them.
Okay, so still being investigated, it sounds like.
Yeah, there's still plenty of work to do on understanding how to tailor the final products to be biodegradable.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, and actually we can circle back at the end if people want to, but the circular bioeconomy includes other things too that are going on campus, that doesn't require this level of processing, but taking plant materials and turning them to try and replace single-use plastics. So I'm with the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment on campus as well. So I'm the Associate Director for Research. And part of our mandate includes campus sustainability. And that includes one of our targets over the last year has been trying to replace single-use plastics with bio-derived materials, like from Miscanthus, and using that to produce plates and utensils and things like that. Okay, awesome. So where our group fits is in the biorefinery design and use of our software BioSteam to do this. It's what makes it possible. And we work with people in feedstock production who have ideas for novel feedstocks, like they're going to take sugarcane and they're going to have it accumulate oil instead of sugar. And so we have that. It's called oil cane. They've had it around for about maybe 12 years now. But it's really incredible. It's like sugarcane. You would squeeze it and get out the sugar. Only it's oil cane. You squeeze it and just oil comes out. It's very easy to turn into biofuels. And then we work a lot with conversion researchers who work in synthetic biology or catalysis or separations to help move their technologies forward. And what that looks like, to give you one example, these are collaborating with a couple folks on campus and one off, but this work where they do genetic modification. So they do what's called metabolic flux analysis and strain design, and they construct this microbe that can take sugar and turn it into succinate, which is succinic acid, is an industrially relevant compound. And they test it out in a flask, and then they test it out at a few liters. And then we have an actual biorefinery on campus called the Integrated Bioprocessing Research Laboratory that can do industrially relevant scale testing up to hundreds of liters of fermentation, for example. And then we work with this team and we design a full-scale biorefinery. And then we simulate its performance and we do cost analysis and life cycle assessment. And so we can do things like this that based on the experimental data. So these are the diamonds was the actual performance, or the square, or the pentagon. And then the box and whisker is our uncertainty range. And we can say that here's the current market price range, is the dark gray zone. So MPSP is the minimum product selling price. This is the cheapest we could sell the product for and still make a profit. The gray zone is from what everybody's suggested that they can do in the literature. So anybody who published and said, we can do this too. This is the full range over which they said their system would cost. And we're near the bottom of this, which is really great, especially for the pilot scale system. We can do the same thing for global warming potential or carbon intensity. And so these lines, the F means it's a reported fossil fuel derived succinic acid. And we're below all of those. So that means we're less carbon intensive. We release fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And then the light gray lines are different bio-based ones. So that's where they're using different biological feedstocks or renewable feedstocks. And we're on par or below most of those, which is also excellent. And so we do those types of analyses to encourage further investment and prioritize additional work. And then this is what our collaborators really love. And that is the key things. They measure three things. The synthetic biologists, they say titer, rate, and yield. So titer is the maximum concentration they can achieve of the product we want. So like succinic acid. So the highest they can get is about 65 grams per liter. And yield is how much succinic acid they got per like gram of feedstock, gram of sugar they put in. And right now they're at about, let's say 37% of the maximum they possibly could. And what we're able to tell them is where they are today. Sure, we can tell them what the cost is. But we can also tell them that if we want to get toward like the gold in here, we want to move up and to the right, but especially to the right, that right now they should focus on improving yield above anything. So we want to, the fastest way to get down in cost is to move to the right. If they move up, they're going to also decrease costs, but not nearly as quickly. And so it lets them focus their efforts. They go back to the strain engineering. They do what's called, they turn off byproduct pathways and do other things back to the drawing board to try and move the yield up, but it helps them prioritize their work. And then lastly, like the students love to, and my group love to come up with different like visualizations and things. So I said the synthetic biologists love tighter rate and yield. So here's tighter and yield and rate is productivity here. They're like, no, we can show all three. So here's all three. I was like, but so then they can vary that third parameter. And what we're showing our collaborators with this type of work is when this graph stops changing, the productivity up here stops mattering. So if once you get above about 0.1, this graph stops changing. It means like if you're above 0.1, you're good. You're not seeing a whole lot of economic benefit from continuing to increase because it's not like the reactor size that's driving costs. So that type of information is also really helpful to them as they test out new strains and evaluate which technologies to move forward. And we have these calls all the time. We were just in a call the other day that we're making the decision about whether to scale up the next one to 300 liters. And because if we do it, it takes about $20,000 to do the test. And so we're running the numbers to say like, okay, well, this was our most recent yield. Is it worth it? Like, do we think that if it performs this way, we're financially viable? And if not, we got to adjust the microorganism again before we move forward. And we've applied this in lots of ways. I have a list of chemicals over here on the right, but we're enjoying helping inform a lot of these decisions. And most recently, we're moving into sustainable aviation fuels. So we have several students focused on that space. But we also connect models across the entire system. So we track the carbon emissions and costs in the field, the transport and logistics, the biorefinery, and then where it goes to the market and what policy incentives would need to be in place for it to be successful. So end to end. And so that's where I'm going to end. So just to kind of summarize where we went so far, we had this quantitative sustainable design as a framework, our sanitation and resource recovery as an example, and then precision fermentation as an example. And if we've got just a few minutes, but I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Yeah, Professor, we had one question early on typed in the comments section about, do you have any papers published on PFAS destruction, or is that something else that's still in development?
Yeah, our collaborator has the first experimental work that demonstrates the PFAS destruction with hydrothermal liquefaction. So I'm happy to send that. So if Doug or Keely, you can connect me with whoever asked the question. Great, Keely's got a thumbs up. I'm happy to share that work. And so that's led by Tim Strathman at Colorado School of Mines. So he does the experimental work and we build the models, and we often co-advise students together. Oh, and we have one model out that's focused on like the financial viability of deploying hydrothermal liquefaction at wastewater treatment plants. And then we're now connecting that with PFAS destruction in the next paper that's not out yet.
Thank you. We have another question. Jess, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks. Hey, Jeremy, thanks for the presentation. Really cool stuff, as always. My question is back to your QSD work. I'm curious on the variables and parameters resulting in detailed design, the algorithms you come up with. How do you go about calibrating the algorithms, or how do you know when you get to a detailed design, it's a good one?
Yeah, it's an important question. And so what we do is, like on the wastewater space, for example, we'll go through Metcalfe and Eddy and MOP8 and everything else that we can to understand what are the reasonable parameter values you can assume. We always validate against GPSX and Sumo and anybody else you want, but they're using if you use the activated sludge models and stuff like that, they're all similar. I was just at IWA, International Water Association Wastewater Resource Recovery Modeling Conference last week, or 2 weeks ago, which is a lot of the kind of best wastewater modelers in the world. And like every other presentation, they're like, yeah, we use default parameters that are in the software. So we start with those, but we make them all uncertain. And so I think we try and capture uncertainty more than is typical. I know we do. And so we push and pull the models, and then we go back and we do try and make sure that the final designs that we're coming up with like are feasible and make sense. And ideally, if it's something we're actually recommending, then we would dive in and see if it's been experimentally tested before or if it makes sense. But mostly we're pushing and pulling the models to guide a conversation with the technology developers or for ourselves, for our own work, to try and prioritize experiments. So it's rare. We're not letting the code develop a design that we then build. It's meant to help make well-informed, transparent decisions about what to do next.
Right on. Cool.
Thanks, Jess.
Well, that was all the questions I saw. Wanted to thank you, Professor. This was excellent presentation. You know, I've done a lot of wastewater work in my past lives, and I found this very fascinating. And I think by the participation, you could see the audience felt the same way.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to follow up. And yeah, I'm happy to send along any of the work or chat. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.